Yeah, you can start,
I can
Jody.
start. Excellent. All
Thanks.
right. Well, thank you, Soraya, for inviting us to come and chat with you all tonight. And I'm excited to see some familiar faces and to share some information with you all. So my name is Jodi Pereira. I am basically connected to a number of different organizations we're going to talk about tonight. So one of them is the Canadian Alliance for Grieving Children, which is really about trying to build grief literacy across the country and, provincially as well. Camp Air in Toronto, I'm also connected with, and then an organization called Compassion, which is again another group that we're trying to build out a broader grief strategy across Canada. So that's some of the work that I've done. I did 10 years with a large community hospice in Peel, which is where I met India. And I was the director of community programs there, and we started a program for children because, of course, we were supporting the individuals that were dying and we were supporting the caregivers, but there was nobody that was supporting the kids or supporting the parents to support the kids. So we created a program to do that better. So that is where I met India. So India will introduce herself and then we'll start into our presentation.
Hi, my name is India, and yeah, as I said, or as Jodi said, I met Jodi when we were both working for a large community hospice organization in Peel. I have a background in pastoral studies, and so that's psychotherapy and spiritual care. I now work for a grief counseling practice, and I work with adults, teens, and kids, talking about grief and bereavement, anything that's sort of end of life adjacent. And yeah, just really happy to be here with you all. I will say I have a number of dogs in my house tonight, so if you hear barking, I apologize in advance, but I'm being overrun by animals at the moment, so sorry if hope we'll try to make it not too disruptive. But
Thanks, India. So we called our presentation The Wilderness of Grief and What You Need to Know to Survive. We were going to do a slide deck, but we've got such a small group, we thought there's no reason that we can't, see your faces or see your names, and so we're going to leave it as it is with no slide deck. But the reason we called it that, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Alan Wolfelt, but he wrote a book called The Wilderness of Grief, and in that book he writes about the feeling of being a bit like grief is like a bit like being wrenched from a somewhat normal life and then being dropped in the middle of a desolate place that is unfamiliar, overwhelming, vast, and wild. So India and I don't expect that we need to explain any of this to you, but that's sort of why we called it what we did. But we're here to assure you and talk about tonight that you're not crazy, you're not abnormal, and you're not any sort of anomaly. That grief is the price of love, and like that love, it's going to remain with you today, tomorrow, and always. So a few of housekeeping things. I think you're all muted, but certainly unmute if you'd like to speak, because of course we absolutely would love to hear your voices, your ideas, your thoughts, if you have things that you want to share. We understand and acknowledge these conversations can be difficult. So you've already got your cameras off. So choose how you need to participate, how little, whether or not you want to participate at all, that those are all options to you. And certainly, we're comfortable with however you decide to participate. We're going to put opportunities to engage and share your experience throughout the presentation. So, feel free to put comments or thoughts in the chat and we'll loop back to them when we get a chance. If you want to talk to something specific as we're speaking, just sort of raise your hand and we will certainly give you the opportunity to share your voice. And we want you to engage in whatever way is comfortable for you. So, again, no pressure. If you don't want to engage, don't. But if you do, then, put up that hand and we will flip the microphone, or in this case, the screen over to you so you have a chance to speak. So we want to start the conversation today with sort of an honoring ceremony. So, in speaking to Sarai, I understand that most of you are grieving parents. Some of you may not be. But India, if you want to take the microphone, and we will do an honoring ceremony where we're going to get you to share the name of the person that you're here remembering.
thanks, Jodi. So yeah, I think there is a common thread that's probably brought most, if not all of us here tonight. And I think sometimes it can be really important to speak those words out loud, to say the names of those people that are no longer able to be physically with us, because sometimes we don't get the opportunity to do that. So again, as per your comfort level, I'm wondering if anyone wants to kind of start by maybe just mentioning what's brought them here. If they have experienced a loss, it doesn't just have to be the loss of a child, but any other kind of grief in their lives, and they're willing to sort of share that with us, then that would be wonderful.
And if you prefer to type it in the chat as well, that's okay too.
Yeah, wonderful. Anything in the chat, we'll keep an eye on it as well. Heather?
I know there's a way to put a hand up, but I can't find it on the bottom of the screen.
Real hand is great. The real hand was just
So
fine.
we're here. We lost our daughter in the spring. Catherine was 19 after a 14-year battle with cancer. In addition, I lost my father in August, and it's been a lot of grief, this in the last year and a half or so. Yeah. So, and my husband's here.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much. That's so tough, especially with that protracted illness. I can imagine that it's been, you know, a long time that you've been kind of thinking about and worrying about this worst case scenario, and then to have it happen is really awful. Yeah, yeah. And I think there's, you know, something that we say in the grief community, that loss is kind of, one loss will sort of trigger unearthing or like undigging of previous losses. And so it's really tough when you endure a bunch of losses in a short span of time. Really kind of compounds and complicates our grief for sure. Yeah. Thanks, Heather.
We really appreciate you sharing.
Oh, here's Bula. Bula, I'm going to read this out if that is that okay. Hopefully that's okay with you. Bula says, I lost my son Mateo in 2017 to leukemia. This is very hard for my family as well. Yeah, of course. He was 10 when diagnosed in November of 2016 and passed away in July 2016. Yeah. Thank you for that, Bula. So tough. Oh, here's another one too. Okay, Kathy. I lost my son Daniel in August of 2021. After his second battle with brain cancer, he was only 5. Okay, yeah. Thank you for that, Kathy. So 2 kind of younger child losses. Again, you know, I think each grief process is certainly unique, but, you know, again, just really, really tough things to be going through. So thank you for your willingness to share.
Does anybody else want to share with us before we continue on? If at any point you want to, you know, share after things have moved forward, certainly by all means, just put it in the chat or put up your hand, because we'd, again, love to honor everybody's individual experiences as they go. So I just wanted to read a slide. We did create a slide deck, as I said, but we did not decide to use it. But there's a slide. I don't know if any of you are familiar with an author or a grief counselor. Her name is Megan Devine. And the quote that we put on the slide was, there's more to it, but I've just cut it down to a little bit more condensed. But her quote basically said, or go out into the woods and tell the trees. It is an immense relief to be able to tell your story without someone trying to fix it. The trees will not ask, how are you really? And the wind doesn't care if you cry. So I think the thing that we want to continue to sort of talk about tonight is the importance of sharing your story. And just before I turn it over to India, I'm going to tell you about an experience that I had. It was with a group in Orangeville. We started a grief group in Orangeville, and it was a child loss group. And of course, like most of you, everybody in the group had lost a child. There was 7 of them. And so we did this grief group, and we met for 3 weeks. And after the 3 weeks, the family said, we can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It hurts, and we can't do it. So of course we stopped the group. Now that group was 12 years ago, and those families that started in that group still get together 4 times a year for dinner. And they don't talk about the child loss, or not necessarily. They decide what they want to talk about. But the fact that they found a community and they, have a common thread that connects them all, and the fact that they're still continuing to meet is, I think, what we want to identify and sort of, underscore is of tremendous importance and value to you, is finding your community and finding your people, and keeping those conversations going. So India, do you want to go on with the next bit?
Yeah, thanks, Jodi. I love that story. I feel like it's so common in doing grief groups that it can be a really tough experience to witness somebody else's grief, especially when you've experienced grief yourself. But there is something really powerful about connecting with other people who have that shared understanding. So yeah, I love that. I think that's sort of the goal of what we're talking about tonight. So yeah, I mean, before we dive in, I'm wondering if anybody has any sort of questions or wonderings or things that they've brought into the meeting tonight, maybe things that you wanted to ask about. You're welcome to raise them now. If not, you can also throw them into the chat. You can send them directly to me so I can read them anonymously. If you'd rather not be identified, that's fine too. But any sort of wonderings or things that you'd like to discuss specifically before we go ahead? Yeah, Heather?
So one thing I'd like to discuss is our teenage son and getting him help. He doesn't want to go to groups. He doesn't want to pursue counseling right now. And my concern isn't right now. It's a year and a bit from now. He'll be going off to university, and I don't want things to hit the fan when he's not at home. And I don't know how to. Do I push? Do we force? How do we help him navigate? When I talk about groups, he goes, I don't need to hear other people's sad stories, and they don't need to hear mine. And I get it. He's a teenage boy. He's not, but I don't want him to have no chance to talk, because I know he's probably nervous or reserved because he doesn't want to upset us. Yeah.
It's a really intimidating prospect, right? To sit in a room of strangers and talk about like the worst thing that's ever happened to you, right? It's a big ask. And I think even, working as a grief counselor, it's a big ask to get people to talk about this thing that's happened. I think we believe that there is merit and catharsis in having the conversation, but it is a really, really hard thing to do. We are going to share some resources later on, Heather, that might be a good sort of toe dipping point for your son. But in the interim, I'm curious, before I sort of speak to that, if anybody else in the group has any experience with that, any sort of wisdom they would want to share, any stories of similar situations that they've encountered.
I think, India, probably both you and I can share camp stories. And I mean, as you were speaking, Heather, I was thinking about that. I mean, certainly, you can't make a teenager do anything. So I 100% get that. But so for example, we did an event at Christmas time where we invited families to come out and do a memorial. Anyway, there were one young adult and one teenager, and they came as a family. So they all came together. They were a unit. Because otherwise, of course, they wouldn't have come individually. Family camp, or when we had our family camp, it was the same thing. A lot of groups came as a family unit to the actual event itself. I was also going to share that this year at camp, for Camp Erin, we actually had 2 mother-daughter combinations of people volunteering to come to camp and be like, not take part in the actual activities, but to come and be buddies to other people that were experiencing loss. So, I mean, and certainly, again, when we cover resources, we can talk about lots of different things. I should also tell, though, that, the story of, I mean, nobody comes to camp thinking it's going to be an awesome thing, or nobody goes to these events. I mean, they're grief events. So, nobody's signing up saying this is going to be the best thing for us. But last year we had a cabin full of campers. They were older. They were all 16 at the time. Anyway, they weren't excited about coming to camp. I mean, I think their parents probably had to push them onto the bus, but they came to camp. And the one girl got off the bus and she ran to her dad and she said, since mom has died, I felt like an alien. She said, but I met my tribe. I went to camp and I met my tribe. And those 4 kids that met each other at camp have this incredible common thread that has kept them connected to this day. They all signed up to come back to camp this year as what we refer to as a mentor with lived experience. They all signed up to come back to camp, not because camp is all about grief and sadness, because, you know, when they walk off the bus, the most amazing thing about camp is when they show up at the buses, you can see all of their faces just thinking, all of these children, all of the people here have lost somebody. Mm-hmm. And it is an absolutely mind-blowing experience for those of us who are sitting on the sidelines, just watching these children come to terms with the fact that where they thought they were all by themselves, where they thought they were the only person in their town or their school or their place, realizes that there is this massive community of people that totally get what their experience is. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't know, like I said, we'll talk more to that, Heather, and of course, I'm more than willing to continue these conversations with you or anybody else who wants to have them. But I think that there are some opportunities out there, you know, where we can, you know, have conversations and try to encourage people to take part. Because I mean, grief camp is anything but sad. So I think at this point, this year, 25% of the volunteers that came back, and we have close to 100 volunteers at camp, 25% of them were past campers. And now they're just coming back so they can, you know, they can support people the way that they were supported through camp. And that's a mix. It's not all girls. There's as many boys as there are girls. Last year, it was my first year at camp last year, the overnight camp. And I went around and I was just talking to people and saying, you know, how did you get here? And anyway, of course, you know, I was talking to these young guys thinking, you know, this is really odd that these young guys are here, but I should have known, that they were there because they had an experience. And of course, they'd all been past campers, every single one of them that I spoke to. So sorry, India, I think I kind of waylaid you.
No, it's okay. I think, you know, I actually was a volunteer at Camp Aaron last summer as well. And the cabin group that I had was like the oldest teenage boys. And some of them were very reluctant to be there, I'll be honest. But they all got something out of it. And there was one in particular who was a late ad, had dealt with a loss relatively recently, was really hesitant, like had to basically be pushed onto the bus, and he ended up really enjoying it. He formed some really good relationships. And, you know, I think in that type of environment, if the grief counseling in a more kind of overt way isn't feeling like a right fit, then maybe just something that's a little bit grief adjacent or allows for those opportunities is a great way to dip your toe in. I will say though that, you know, I think everybody processes grief in their own time, and especially teenagers, you know, there's a lot of other things going on. Emotions are really, really big, right? Like I remember being in high school and we feel everything in such a big way, right? Like a breakup, you know, there's anything. It just, I think our emotions, our hormones are all kind of going wild, and things feel like really magnified. So the thought of kind of opening that box might just be a little bit too much for him right now. And I think that's totally okay. There isn't really a time frame in which we have to do this work, right? I think it's really, really wonderful that you're aware of the potential risk of, you know, something happening with your son. But the fact that he's sort of willing to say, have a conversation and say that he's not interested, but that you've kind of got it on the radar, I think, you know, you'll likely notice some signs that maybe there needs to be a further discussion if things start to sort of move in that direction. I think, you know, I have a lot of clients personally who come to grief work a lot later because it's just, it doesn't feel like the right time to do it when they're kind of in the early stages of a loss. So I would definitely encourage something if he's willing to engage, but I also wouldn't worry too much if he's not quite willing to engage yet, because I think there's always opportunities to do that work. I hope that answers your question a little bit, but oh, what are those signs? Yeah, so I think with teenagers, anything that is like a significant change in behavior. So, you know, with school age kids, things like, you know, significant changes in their emotional regulation, maybe behavior challenges at school, either becoming like a lot more extroverted or more introverted. So it's not always I think we can think of the common symptoms, which are like more of the withdrawal, isolation, depression kind of stuff. But anything that feels like it's off of his baseline, and that's something that you can tell probably more than anyone else. Some kids become sort of a little bit more active and extroverted in their social kind of circles, maybe as a means of distraction or as a way of coping, to try to be a different person than this person who's grieving, right? So it's hard to say specifically, but I would say anything that looks like it's deviating from what his sort of typical range of behavior would be, in either direction. If he gets really fixated on some particular thing, then that could also be a sign of attention that's being diverted from the grief. But again, we have a bunch of, which we'll share at the end of this as well, but we have a bunch of resources on there. There's Kids Grief, which has an amazing like number of things for kids, teens, kind of all ages. There's also a really great website called What's Your Grief that has really accessible articles for individuals supporting grievers, people who are grieving, but a lot of the information is written by people who have gone through grief and bereavement. So it really targets kind of practical and meaningful aspects of the grief experience. Yeah. Jodi, is there anything you would add to that?
I don't think so. No, I think you covered it, what I would have suggested.
Okay, great. Any other questions or thoughts or wonderings before we move forward? Okay. All right. So again, feel free to throw a hand up or write something in the chat at any moment if you have any thoughts or questions, wonderings, or something I say or Jodi says sparks some sort of curiosity in you. But I think, yeah, you know, the title that we had for this slide is just Grief, Fast, and Forever. So I think, you know, one of the main things that I think it's important to acknowledge in grief is that it's not something that we get over. I think it's common in, you know, our lexicon. We talk about getting over grief, moving on. And these are, I think, you know, not very realistic expectations for people who are grieving. It can set a sort of unreasonable standard that I think is really problematic and hard to live with as somebody who's grieving. So, you know, we say that grief is more of a process. It's not just a single event. There's this famous individual academic, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard about, who talked about the 5 stages of grief. And that's kind of like the model that I think a lot of us have of grief in our minds. And it's certainly useful in certain senses, but I think it implies that there's this sort of linearity to grief where we go through certain stages, and then once we get to the end of it, which is like acceptance, then we're there and that's it. And even Elizabeth herself kind of acknowledged later in life that she would have revised this theory if she had had the time or the opportunity, because it isn't really an accurate representation of what grief looks like. I think grief is more of a sort of roller coaster with upside down, you know, corkscrews and squiggly lines and feeling like you're going backwards 2 steps and then forward 1. And it's not a process that's linear. It's not a process that is prescribed or specific. It's a really, really unique journey for individuals, even individuals in the same family who are dealing with the same loss. might have a really, really vastly different grief experience or grief journey from one another. I think that's what makes it so challenging in so many ways, is to navigate our own grief, but then also be aware of and acknowledge the grief of the people around us. So all that to say, whatever your grief looks like, if you are grieving, there's nothing wrong with it, even if it doesn't look like any grieving process that you've ever seen before. It is something that we learn to live with, we learn to reconcile ourselves with, and we find ways to keep living with the grief. But I think rather than setting an expectation that one day we're just going to feel okay, sort of, as I said, learning to live with is kind of maybe a little bit more of a useful framework. There's a metaphor that one of my clients shared with me that I really love. And it's this idea of an individual who's carrying a massive boulder, and the boulder is their grief. And so in the early days, it just feels like this huge, heavy burden that is making it almost impossible to move with. And over time, it's not that the boulder necessarily gets any smaller, but that we grow stronger underneath it. So the more that we keep living and existing, the more that we develop that sense of resilience, and our capacity to believe in the fact that we can keep living even when it feels like we can't. And so maybe over time that weight starts to feel a little bit lighter, but it certainly takes a while. And I think the expectations that are often set for grief in the medical community are not very realistic. So, you know, sometimes I don't know what your individual experiences were with doctors or other medical professionals, but there isn't really a lot of grief literacy or grief training within the medical community, unfortunately. So sometimes the effects of the grief can be minimized a little bit. So that's where people like Jodi and I will sort of sweep in and say, you know, this is a lifelong process. Not to say that it's going to feel as bad as it does in the early days forever, but it is something that takes a while to kind of work through. Any sort of thoughts or questions or anything you wanted to add on that, Jodi?
I think the only thing I was going to add was around secondary losses, right? Because again, you know, it's not just the loss of the person, you know, it's the loss of the future and the ideas and the dreams and all kinds of other things that come along with that. Yeah. And so, you know, and again, you know, when we're talking, you know, like your experience, Heather, where you're talking about another person that you've also lost and those other losses. So, you know, really that the importance of, you know, being kind to yourself and being compassionate and understanding that these things, you know, again, I said it in the beginning that the price of love is grief. You know, and like love, that grief will continue because that person's always going to be in your heart. Like they're always going to be with you, right? So, you know, I think that it's important, you know, to consider the analogy that India has said and sort of, you know, think about what and how that resonates with you and, you know, how you think about processing, you know, the work that you have to do around, you know, your own experience.
Yeah, I love that, Jodi. Thank you. I think it is so important because there's all these things that we don't realize. You know, I think in the early days of grief, we're very much often missing that person's physical presence, and it's, you know, the more obvious aspects of the loss that kind of hit us. But over time, it is, you know, there's moments in life where you inevitably want to share them with the people that you love, and that's when we're aware of those secondary losses, and it's that loss of opportunity for continued connection with that physical presence that's really hard. Having said that, you know, I think there still are opportunities to cultivate and maintain that relationship. It just unfortunately, but necessarily has to look a little bit different. Yeah. Thanks, Jodi. I really like also there's a model for grief called the dual process model, and basically what it looks like is I'm going to stop and I'm going to read what Bula said.
I was going to say, I can read it if you want.
Oh, okay, go for it.
What helped me, oops, I just lost it. What helped me was going to a bereaved parent group before even considering going back to work. My husband was not interested in this at all because he doesn't really like to talk about this with other strangers. My daughter was 8 at the time, so it took her a while to talk eventually to eventually talk to somebody. And then she commented on the fact she also likes the wave theory.
Yeah, so waves of grief is another great metaphor, which is the idea that, you know, grief hits us like a sort of big tsunami wave. And there's moments when it sort of hits us in a totally unexpected way. And in those moments, it can feel like we're drowning, right? And we have no control over our feelings, our emotions, how we are existing in that moment. The only thing that we can do is just sort of wait for it to abate and for it to pass. And I think that it is so true. A lot of people will describe the more acute kind of flare-ups of their grief as waves of grief. And I think, again, the hope is that over time, the waves maybe don't hit as hard, maybe they don't hit as frequently, but, you know, occasionally they will, right? And I think that's just the reality of living with a loss, is that those waves are always going to come, but they may not hit us with the same intensity as they did in the early days.
When we're talking
Thank you for
about
that, Bula. Yeah.
I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, India, but when you're
That's
talking
okay.
about children, they always say, you know, there is some differences because children tend to be puddle jumpers. They refer to it as where they self-protect, I think, a little bit better than adults do, because adults, I mean, they get hit by the wave and then they wallow in the river, right? They're just in the depths of it and they don't know how to sort of get out of it because it's all consuming for them, where kids seem to be better at sort of regulating that. So they're going to jump in the puddle and it's going to be big. It's going to feel big, but then they're just as quickly going to jump out of the puddle because they can't handle it. Like they can't be in that place anymore and they can't regulate those emotions. So they get out of the puddle and then they come back into it and then they go back out of it and they come back into it. You know, sort of in volumes, I guess, that are more manageable for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, even Vula, in your example here, you sort of describe 3 different journeys of grief, right? Yours, so going to a bereaved parent group, finding that was super helpful. Your husband sort of feeling like that was not a good fit for him and that talking about his emotions is something that was not really a realistic expectation or something that he was interested in. And then your daughter sort of, you know, again, going through her own grief journey at the age of the loss, and then probably continuing to process that in a different way as she grows and matures and is able to access and understand it a little bit differently. So yeah, it's a really, really great example. Thank you for that.
No problem. Sorry, I don't have, this is Bula.
Hi, Bula.
Hi, sorry, I don't have a little hand wave. I can't find it on my computer.
That's
for some
okay.
reason.
We can hear you. So go ahead, whatever
Sorry.
you would
Hi.
like to say.
Yeah, no, I just like wanted to mention, like my daughter, like she was younger than I guess Heather, your son is, but it, you know, it took her a while, and then eventually she was willing to speak to at school, the social worker, and I took her to speak to someone once, but I think that was enough for her, like at the time, like she was younger too. And, you know, occasionally we'll, you know, just kind of go through things ourselves and talk about things. But there's always like moments where I have a younger one as well. And she'll like look at me and she knows that I'm feeling sad because something triggered like some thought or emotion or something made me think about like our son and that. So the one thing I did want to talk about is maybe if you touch on a bit is guilt. That's something that I always constantly think about.
Yeah, for
Thanks.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. We have a sort of section coming up that's going to deal specifically with that. So I think that's such a good point. And I agree, Bula. I think, you know, as kids varying ages of development, they may not need a lot of support. They may sort of have enough understanding of what's going on. And like I said to you, Heather, you know, it's never too late to come back to this work. So, you know, your daughter, Bula, may get to an age where she does want to talk about it a little bit more. She is understanding it in a different way. Sometimes grief flares up in moments when we wouldn't necessarily expect it, like maybe a sibling who's lost someone when they're getting married or when they're having kids is when all of a sudden it sort of comes up because there's a parallel in their lives that they can then acknowledge. So not to say that it is going to waylay them in any way or derail them, but just that, you know, it is something that continues to emerge as life unfolds, and there's always opportunity to engage with it. But the biggest thing, I think, is just a willingness to have the conversation. And like you've said, Heather, and you've said, Bula, you're having those conversations with your families, and that's really the best thing that you can be doing. So yeah. Anything you wanted to add there, Jodi?
Nope, I don't think so.
No? Okay. I think what I was going to mention before we move forward was just this other sort of model analogy for grief, which is this dual process model that I like, which basically just talks about, rather than grief being this kind of linear experience, it's a shift between a loss orientation, so kind of looking back, and a restoration orientation and looking forward. And in the early days, we're looking back a lot. And I think we'll talk about this a bit more, but this is where a lot of those feelings of guilt or why or what if, maybe I could have done something different, the regrets, the shoulds are really, really kind of front of mind. And then I think the hope is that eventually we sort of look back so that then we can reflect, reconcile ourselves with the new reality that we're living with, and then be able to start looking forward. And not to say that we stop looking back at any point. The grief sort of becomes an oscillation between this looking back and looking forward, but that we need to kind of keep connected to our past to move forward in our future. And I think that speaks a little bit more to what grief actually looks like, rather than it just being this process where we get to a certain point and we never go back. There's no setbacks. It's all just part of this process, part of the journey of grief. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions or wonderings before we move on?
So the next slide, which we don't have, but the next thing we're going to talk about is something we called rocks and thorns. So, you know, in this, we address the fact that people are uncomfortable having conversations. They're uninformed. They're not conversations. We have a death-defying society. People don't want to talk about death. They don't want to talk about grief, and they don't know how to do it. So at camp, we have something called Roses, Buds, and Thorns. And at the end of every day, we talk about the things that were really good. We talk about the things we're looking forward to the next day. And we talk about the things that, you know, were hurtful or, you know, not helpful, not necessarily that happened at camp, but in their lives or their experiences. So we're going to talk a little bit about that right now, and sort of some of the weird things that people say and do, and sort of what to do with that information and those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Jodi. I think, you know, like you said, we do live in this culture that's very much like averse to discussing death and dying and grief and bereavement. And so that does lead to a lot of uncomfortable conversations and interactions after somebody has lost a loved one, or when somebody is dealing with someone who is really sick, right? Or potentially has a life-limiting illness. So I'm curious, you know, I don't know, before we kind of move forward, if any of you have had any of those interactions, any things that people said that you were just like, oh my gosh, how on earth do you think that was an appropriate thing to say? Or yeah, anything that anybody wants to share that they've encountered?
You'll learn that I like to talk a lot, so
That's okay.
my husband is quiet and I talk a lot. I've had people compare it to losing a parent, losing their pets, losing non-loss, not death, but through divorce or other issues, family issues. And or the other one that I really struggle with is, how many kids do you have?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to say one.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's very dishonoring to our daughter. And but so I just say 2, 1 in heaven and 1 here, and some people will skim over it and keep going, and other people will ask, but most people skim over it. They don't want to talk about it.
They don't want to talk about it. Yeah.
No.
I love that answer though, Heather, because I think it's one of the hardest questions to get asked, right? Because it's like, well, how do I answer that? What do I say? Am I going to invite unwanted questions? You know, are people going to start asking me about things that I'm going to have to disclose that one of them's died, and then they're going to get all weird and not want to talk to me anymore? And, you know, it's really uncomfortable. And I think it can feel very burdensome to exist as a grieving person in the world, as if you're somehow inconveniencing people from kind of like moving on with their normal, happy lives, you know? And I think that's really disappointing and really frustrating. And it puts a lot of onus on people who are already going through something really difficult, which is so frustrating.
Yeah. And Kathy put a comment in the chat, sorry, India, and she said, yes,
go ahead.
I've had people say, at least you have another son. And that doesn't lessen the loss of my son. And of course it doesn't. It doesn't do any of those things. It doesn't make it hurt less. And in a lot of cases, you know, it again compounds the pain, right? It hurts that much more when people say those types of things. You know, I remember one little girl I met, she'd gone back to school after her brother had died. And the teacher basically just said to her, okay, you've been off for 2 weeks and now you've got to get back at it. Like, okay, well, that isn't actually how it works. I mean, her brother died, you know, he was with her for a very long time, and she's going to need some time, and it's going to take her some time. And, you know, so, I mean, there are very strange things that people say. And like I said, I think the key piece is to realize that they're saying them because they really just have no idea what to say. So, you know, they talk, and it's not necessarily helpful. And India, again, you can talk more a little bit about this, I think, than I can, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really good point. It's just that people don't really, oh yeah, Bula, do you want to read out Bula's comment, Jodi?
Yeah. If I feel comfortable with the person and it's appropriate, I will mention that I had an older son. Yeah,
I think it's such a process of discerning how much you want to say and realizing that you do have the autonomy to say as much or as little as you want, right? Like that you don't owe this story to anybody, but that you might want to tell people, and that it's not your responsibility to make them feel comfortable about it, right? It's about you sharing as much as you want about your life and that person, or as little as you want, right? And I think it is very circumstance dependent, context dependent. Yeah. Jodi, sorry, were you going to say something else?
Nope.
Okay. I think the other thing is that, people don't really know what to say. Oftentimes people just don't say anything. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but there can be sort of a tidal wave of support in the few weeks after somebody has died. There's lots of cards and maybe like casseroles showing up on your doorstep and flowers and all of that. And then, you know, the funeral, the memorial, all of that is over. And then all of that sort of abates, where people are like, okay, I've done my sort of condolence thing and I can move forward now, you know? And I think for a lot of people, that's really when the depth of the despair hits, because there's this incredible sense of loneliness. And also the reality is sort of, you know, the shock is wearing off and the reality of the situation is starting to hit. And I think that's when most people say to me that that's when they need the support, you know, the people even just, you know, checking in or saying, you know, I don't know what you need, but just know that I'm here if there is something, you know, what can I do to support you? But the unfortunate reality is that a lot of people don't know what to say, and they worry that they're going to say the wrong thing. So instead of saying the wrong thing, they say no thing, and then they kind of disappear. And that's really, really devastating, right? I think sometimes it's not necessarily out of a lack of care, but it's just a profound discomfort with the conversation. Maybe it triggers something in their own lives that they haven't acknowledged, or they're not willing to acknowledge, or they're not ready to acknowledge. And so they have to sort of distance themselves for that reason. But it's really, really hard to exist in the world as a griever. And I think, you know, the point of having this conversation is just to say that, unfortunately, I think people will continue to say things that just don't land. And it's okay to be hurt by them and upset by them. And it's okay to be mad about it or sad about it. But the hope is that, you know, you will have some positive encounters as well. And through those kind of sticky situations, you'll maybe learn how to navigate your side of the conversation so that you don't have to worry too much about those difficult bits. So like you said, Heather, maybe you have your sort of line in hand for when you think you might have a question about what happened with your daughter. You know, maybe it's just sort of anticipating when you're going into social situations, or, you know, seeing people for the first time since this has happened. Like, who do I want to talk to about this? Do I want to talk about it? Is there an opportunity for me to step away if I feel like I'm becoming overwhelmed? Can I give myself permission to do that? Because it's an overwhelming and exhausting process. So yeah. Anything there, Jodi, that you wanted to add?
Not from me, I don't think. I think just if there's anything else that anybody else wanted to share before we sort of move on to the next conversation, which is really about compassion and self-compassion. So I don't see anything come up in the chat. So do you want to continue?
Yeah, so I think, you know, again, talking about this piece of compassion, you know, especially with a child loss, and not to say, I think I don't want to conflate, all losses are unique, and even the loss of, you know, you could have a child of the same age with the same diagnosis and could still, you know, feel very different for different individuals walking through that. So I hesitate to compare losses because I know that that can be something that's really triggering and hard, like you mentioned, Heather. But I think there are common threads amongst those groups or individuals who have lost children. I think there's something profoundly unnatural about outliving your child. And it's a really, really horrific and destabilizing experience because it's not something that you ever expect to happen. You know, not to minimize the loss of a parent, it's really, really difficult to lose a parent. And I don't want to say that that's not a really tough experience, but it is very different from losing a child. And I think, especially like you mentioned, Bula, you know, I talk to lots of different people who have encountered lots of different types of losses, and guilt is probably the most common, most insidious emotion that I hear across the board, regardless of the nature of the loss, the circumstances, whether it was sudden, whether it was expected, whether it was a protracted illness, whether it was a parent, a child, a sibling. Guilt is almost universal, and it's awful. It's a really horrible feeling to think that you know, to worry that you could have done something different. I unfortunately, you know, I don't have an answer as to why. I think my working theory with guilt has become that, you know, we as human beings, we want to understand our environment. We want to understand the world around us. We're inherently kind of curious, but we also have a desire for answers. We don't like things to be sort of ambiguous. So we like to try to make meaning out of things. And I think when something happens like a death, where we can't fully understand why it happened, we might know that somebody got cancer and that's what caused them to die, but we don't have any understanding of why they got cancer. Why did somebody else get cancer? Why did they die of the cancer when somebody else didn't die of that cancer? We can't really make sense of it. And our human brains, who are really logic driven, don't have a way to compute that. We don't understand it. So we sort of fall back on our emotional mind, which is, well, I have to sort of make sense of it. Maybe there's something I could have done. And I will say that I think guilt is one of the emotions that takes a while to work through. But once, I think over time, not to say that it ever goes away completely, but I think that the heaviness with which we may look at the loss and those feelings of guilt or regret that we may kind of think about the loss in or through the lens of, will start to lighten a little bit. There's a really good video. we've already compiled our list, but you can probably find it on YouTube or something. I wish I could remember the name of it. I'm going to try to remember when Jodi's going over the resources, and I'll put it in the chat. But it's a really great video of a woman, and she's sort of talking about what grief looks like. And she says it starts as like this hand in front of your face, and that's all you can see. And as we move forward, it sort of starts to step further away, and you can see a little bit more of the world around you. And eventually over time, it sort of becomes a little bit less obvious, and it's not right in our immediate frame. And it's not that it's gone away, but it's just that our lens of the world has expanded again. And I think that's sort of what happens with the guilt piece, is that we maybe can't get an answer, but we can reconcile ourselves with the fact that we may never get an answer, and we sort of learn to live with that. Any other thoughts on guilt, or any other questions on that? Wonderings? Okay. So, I mean, I think the big thing about guilt is it's one of the things that, one of the counter indicators of compassion, right? And I think the instinct, especially, you know, with a child loss, is like that we should have, as a parent, been able to protect them from this thing, to prevent it, and that can breed a lot of guilt, regret, resentment. But I think one of the biggest antidotes for that over time is this cultivation of a sense of compassion. And it's a big ask. It's hard. It's not something that is easy for people who aren't even going through grief, let alone people who are grieving. But I think it can be a really, really powerful tool to mitigate against some of those negative feelings associated with grief. So just this idea of being kind to ourselves, you know, maybe talking to ourselves the way that a kind or compassionate, gentle friend would, and acknowledging that, you know, at the end of the day, we haven't actually done, you know, we haven't done anything wrong. It isn't our fault. And slowly kind of exposing ourselves to those thoughts and ideas, which may not really land in the early days, but I think the hope is that over time we sort of start to really believe it, even if we don't early on. So there is, again, Jodi's going to share some resources, but Kristen Neff is a wonderful clinician who talks about self-compassion. She has some wonderful, she has a book, she has a workbook, she has like guided meditations and a whole bunch of things that sort of introduce this practice of self-compassion, which, you know, I think both Jodi and I really believe can be an important part of this grieving process, especially as we move kind of further along in our grief journeys.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, India. So I'm going to talk about resources. Soraya, after we finish up today, is going to send you a couple of different resources. One's a holiday tip sheet. One is a tip sheet with a lot of different things on it. I'm going to say that, of course, the list is by no means exhaustive. I mean, there could be a million more books and a million more things added to that list, but one of the things that I'm always very conscious about is not overwhelming somebody with a book or an encyclopedia of resources, but just sort of giving you a few that, you know, people in the grief space feel like are fairly good resources, so that you don't get lost wandering from one to the other, but you connect with the one that resonates with you. I think the key is finding sort of an outlet to help you process your grief, and that resonates with you, your special person, your family, and your life. Because again, sort of carrying that person's memory and that person's, the love for that person into your life is really what you need. You need to integrate it, and you need to find ways to integrate it. So from a resource perspective, the list has got in-person resources. So it talks about or identifies, I've tried to identify where there's fee for service, where there's not fee for service, in case the financial elements are, you know, a consideration for you. So in-person service resources, I always suggest that you look for local hospices. They typically offer education, one-to-one groups for adults, those types of things. When we were talking about self-compassion, Dorothy Lay in Etobicoke used to run a self-compassion group. And I'm not sure if Acclaim Health did, but I believe that they did for a period of time. So those were groups that you could attend that didn't have any fee associated with them. Funeral homes often will organize groups as well. If you go on Heart House Hospice's website, they have how to run a grief group toolkit. So you could actually, you know, if you're connected to a community of people that also have had experiences with loss, you could go on there and you could actually run your own group with your own folks and your own people in your own community. So there's, you know, there's no shortage of options. You just sort of have to know where to find them. Bereaved Families of Ontario, I don't have a sense of, there's Mid and Central and Toronto, and they've got, you know, different regional areas, but if you go on their website, you know, you can sort of find out what location you fall within. Or of course you can email me. There's going to be a contact at the end of, it's at the end of the slide presentation, but we'll make sure that Soraya sends it to you, because if Indy and I can help in any way after the fact and connect you to a place, please just reach out, and we'll certainly do that. So Bereaved Families of Ontario, again, they have education, they have in-person groups and virtuals, and most of those I believe are kind of peer-led. So they're led by people that have had experiences. So then there's camps. So these are opportunities for either children and youth, or sometimes as families. So Camp Erin Toronto is an overnight camp for children and youth. It opens in, the camp itself happens in June, but registration happens in January. They're also running a family camp this year in the summer months, with the date hasn't been secured yet, but if it is something that you're interested in, if you go on Camp Erin Toronto and you sign up to be on the distribution list, then you'll get information when those camps happen. And so essentially, again, they're a grief camp. These are all, you know, sort of grief camp models. Campfire Circle, some of you may be familiar with Campfire Circle when it was Camp Butcher, Camp Tamo. They also, I believe, have a program for bereaved siblings and families, so you can go on Campfire Circle and look into that. Camp Keaton is out of Hamilton. They have a children youth overnight camp as well, through Bob Kemp Hospice. One that might be of interest to this group is Lumara, is an organization, a not-for-profit out in BC. And they also run a location here in Toronto, in Ontario, called Camp Carey. They typically have their family camp in October. I think it's a 4-day camp. Quite often families that have been, their kids have been to Camp Erin have also been to Lumara. And they again say, you know, it's an incredible experience to connect with people. So I've heard very, very good things about it. Camp Skeen is also another camp, which is a 5-day camp for kids, children and youth. So those are some of the camps. There's not an exhaustive number of family camps yet, but if, again, you look into local organizations, quite often they might do sort of memorial type of events. And if they do those, then of course they're usually community or public events and anybody's welcome. Did anybody want to chat before I go on to sort of the next? Yep, go ahead, Heather.
So what is the time frame for going to camp? Like, do we have to, like, if our son's really against going, can my husband and I still go? Or do you kind of have to have a kid to take with you?
I think for Lumara, I'm not sure that you need to have a kid. And so the timing for Lumara would be you'd register. I believe they open registration in April, and then camp happens in October. For the family camp for Camp Erin, once they actually confirm the date, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can come as a family or you could come just the two of you. It's because really it's the model is just the fact that it's an opportunity for you to process grief. So as long as you understand there will be activities that are both geared to kids and activities that are geared to adults, then you know that there wouldn't be an issue. The overnight camp, like where I'd suggested to you, there's those two groups where the parents are coming to volunteer and then the child is coming as well. Again, that would be, you would sign up to volunteer in December, and then the camp itself happens in June. So, and I think on the actual sheet that I've sent, I put the time frames in there. But if you go to the websites and check them out, Like I said, most of them have, you can get on a distribution list if it's something that's of interest to you. And, you know, you're certainly, then you'll be getting all of the information. I believe Gilda's Club this year, I think Gilda's Toronto is on that list as well. They're offering a family camp this year. And they're doing that in, I believe it's the last weekend in May. Now I believe that it's full, but again, that is another opportunity of sort of a camp style sort of, you know, family event that people could do as well. And this is the first year they've piloted it at Gilda's, but if it's successful, then I assume that they'll do it again. So just the other thing that goes in on this tip sheet that you're going to get, it goes into child and family support. So again, in addition to the ones that I've said, which are more general and more municipally possible, you know, you will be, Soraya said she was from Barrie. So Seasons Center for Grieving Kids is in Barrie. If anybody lives in Lighthouse, they've got Nightingale Center for Grieving Children in Guelph. In Halton, they've got the Lighthouse Center for Grieving Children in Oakville. In Toronto, Yorktown Family Services has an arm where they work with grief. Durham area, they've got JAG, Village, Gilda's Club Toronto, Wellspring. So again, you know, you may be able to find children and family supports within your particular regional area. And these groups might offer in-person, some of them might, or in-person, virtual or support groups. But again, if you contact any of those programs, you can find out what types of programs they have. The list also includes private grief counselors. So there's lots of different grief counselors on there. Again, they're fee for service, but they specialize in working with people that are grieving. That's the population that they work with largely. Online resources, we've identified lots of them. You know, India made the point that, you know, I've included lots of books if you're a reader, but if you're not a reader, but you liked to listen to podcasts or you've got short attention and you can't commit to a big book, there's lots of great grief podcasts. So by all means, look them up, but I did provide some resources. Excuse me. Family Education Center has a 6-series e-learning module called Parenting Grieving Children. They've got tip sheets in multi-languages. So again, if you're, you know, grieving yourself and supporting them, there's some resources there. India alluded to Canadian Virtual Hospice. Once a month, they have a Q&A, the first Tuesday every month. So that date is on there if you have any conversations about, you know, your child, your other child, the children that in your family, if they need support. These are good avenues for that. They also have a number of resources on there from, you know, an education perspective as well, or modules. Grief Stories is an organization out of Toronto, and they do short videos for people who are living with different experiences. So this is something that you could, you could engage in and watch, or you could actually offer to share your story, because this is really a collection of people sharing lived experience with different death and different grief experiences. So this is something that you could watch, or it's something that you could also contact them if you were interested in sharing your story to support others. And then there's a couple of other online resources, Refuge in Grief, Megan Devine, What's Your Grief, which we talked about. And then there's a video on resilience, which is Lucy Hone, who's a researcher in Australia. So it's an interesting TED Talk if you're interested in that. Anyway, it lists lots of online resources, both for parents, family, and kids. If you want to set your kids up with any type of resource online, adult books, it lists a number, but I would encourage anybody here who's on this call, if you have books, resources, or any kind of support that you've used that was helpful. I think it was maybe Kathy who referred to going to a bereavement group. So again, if you are familiar with resources, please by all means share them. But again, there's lots of books, both for children, youth, and adults, if you have any interest, in reading some material about things. So I think that's all that I had about resources. Like I said, Soraya is going to send this resource list to you. We also did a resource list, which is really just around, Bereaved Families of Ontario, Vula said, and they have some great groups for sure. We also sent through a tip sheet. So it really, it's called remembering on special days and through the holidays. So, you know, birthdays come up, and Mother's Day and Father's Day, and, you know, I mean, any kind of special days. It could have been a family day weekend, a holiday. So it talks about different ways that you can bring that person, you know, into your traditions, into your celebrations, you know, integrating them in a different way than they were before, but integrating them into all of those special days and times, and continuing that. So I think, oh, art therapy and music therapy. I mean, I've heard some incredible things that families have done. Again, you know, this wouldn't resonate with everybody, but it resonates with some people. But one family told me about how they did handprints in their front door. Because again, I guess they can do that if you have a picture of your child's hands, and they put handprints of everybody in their family in their front door. And again, just another way to integrate that person, you know, into this experience, this new reality, right? Just a constant reminder of your love and that person in your life. Music therapy, anybody who's seen Guardians of the Galaxy, right? He's got the tape of his mom and he listens to it all the time. So create a playlist. I mean, have a music therapist come out and write a song. You know, there are lots of things that you can do, and you know, those activities can be very therapeutic, and they can be something that really, again, brings that person and that memory into your experience. We didn't leave any time for questions and answers, but we did do questions and answers throughout. So I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts, questions, ideas, things that they'd like to share?
Sorry, Jodi, I saw Heather had asked about honoring your child's birthday. So I think, Heather, probably in those resources, there will be a number of things, but the holiday tip sheets, I think, are particularly helpful in, you know, outlining. I don't know, Jodi, if we can send the Dougie Center one as well. Could you add that to the ones that you're sending Sarai?
I don't know. The Doogie Center Doogie Center is not on the list, so I can absolutely add that one.
Yeah, so there's one that has it's a holiday tip sheet, so it's designed for sort of like Christmases, but the end of it has a really great sort of outline for how to have a conversation with the family about how you want to navigate that day. So giving everybody a chance to discuss, because I think one of the hardest things is, you know, you might want to do something and dad might say, no, I don't want to do that, it's too hard. Or your son might say, you know, I don't want to have a cake, or, you know, whatever it is. So a sort of structured way to have a conversation about how to approach that day, where everybody's opinions and thoughts are kind of acknowledged and respected. And that way you can come to a decision together about what feels right for you. I really like that outline. But yeah, there's lots of suggestions about it. I would say the thing is just to, you know, what's your daughter's name, if I can ask?
Catherine.
Yeah, her name is Catherine.
Okay, Catherine, thank you. So, you know, just doing something that you think Catherine would like, right? Doing something that feels personal and unique to you. So maybe it's, you know, maybe your family never does cake, but maybe they, you know, you would always go to a particular restaurant. Maybe that's something that you want to do, ordering in food from there. Doing an activity that maybe Catherine loved to do, whatever that might be. You know, finding a way to make it personal, if you know, whatever it is, but if she had a favorite food, then maybe incorporating that into your meal, or making her favorite dinner, or, you know, there's so many ways that you can go about it. Just kind of being able to have the conversation in advance about how you might want to do it is a big part too. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I will, Soraya, just before you send out the tip sheets, give me a minute and I'll send you the Doogie.
No worries, Jodi. I was actually going to send it tomorrow morning or tomorrow.
Okay.
So you
that will give me some time to flip that to you, because I'll send you the Doogie
sure.
Center thing. And was there one other thing we talked about sharing, India, that
like the Grief Education Day thing too, if you want it. I sent
okay,
you
so yeah,
link.
so flip that to me, and then I will flip the Doogie Center holiday sheet as well. And like I said, the holiday tip sheets there. The other thing, we had a horticulturist come to one of our events when I was working at the Heart House Hospice, and they talked about planting a garden, right? Plant a garden, plant a seed, plant a plant in honor of the person. You know, and then you've got, you know, where that we started at the beginning with Megan Devine talking to the trees. You can talk to the plant every single day because it's in your house, you know, and you can nurture that plant and talk to that plant. And again, it's not the same thing, but it's that constant reminder of that person, of that love, and all of that experience, right? So, so there's just one other thing I'm going to read before we close, but just wanting to make sure that we don't, you know, give anybody not an opportunity to talk before we close off. I know that both India and I are very honored to have been here with you tonight. As I said, I know that we're both very sincere in saying if there is any, you know, support or resources that we can send, please do not hesitate to reach out. We'll make sure that Soraya includes our contact information. But I leave you with this. So again, it's Megan Devine. You'll get the sense that she is somebody that, you know, has a lot of words that certainly resonate with people. And of course, it comes from a place of her own lived experience. But what we both wish for you, Megan Devine and India and I, is I wish this for you, to find the people you belong with, the ones who will see your pain, companion you, hold you close, even as the heavy lifting of grief is yours alone. As hard as they may seem to find at times, your community is out there. Look for them, collect them, knit them into a vast flotilla of light, and hold them close. Again, finding a community of people that will be there to companion you through this is just a vital part of it. So we encourage you all to take the time to do that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your willingness to, you know, meet tonight and share your stories. I know this is a big ask and it's really hard to talk about, but I think it's so important too. So thank you for your willingness to engage and be present.
Certainly. Thank you so much to everyone who came tonight. I just want to mention a few things before we close. So OPACC has a page on our website, opac.org/bereavement, where we have a bunch of resources, a lot of the places you mentioned, but you've mentioned so many others. So I'll add those on there as well. And of course, your own organization, the Canadian Alliance for Grieving Children and Youth. And send me the resources. I'll send it to all our attendees. I'll put them up on our website if that's okay. I'll just put a PDF link to those resources. And we have our Tuesday night drop-ins virtually like this with our parent liaisons, with our community of parents for peer support. These are all parents on all stages of their journey, from newly diagnosed to parents of survivors, to bereaved parents as well. All are welcome. To talk to our parent liaisons, to talk to other parents who have gone through this experience and know what you're feeling. And let me see if there was anything else. Heather, just real quick, you mentioned that your son is going to university, and I was just thinking maybe at the university they have a group, a peer support group or a grieving group. Like I know your daughter went to Queens. And I just looked it up while we were talking. They do have a club there called Good Morning. And it's the first and only grief club at Queens. They're not counseling, they're not therapy. They're students run by students for students who are grieving. So maybe your son, when he's ready, can find a community at university as well to support him. Just a thought anyway, but something to look into, yeah.
We've got another year yet, but it'll be here before we know it.
Yeah, my daughter too is going next year, so
we got one more year to go.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much, India and Jodi. I don't know if anybody has any final thoughts or questions. Feel free to ask now or type them in the chat before we go. If not, thank you again for everybody who is here tonight, and India and Jodi, and I'll be happy to share those resources with our families tomorrow. And have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Night.
Take care. Night.